Hello everyone, this is part 7 of What If Naruto Was Like the Sage of Six Paths, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Luckily for the two of them, they actually managed to stumble across a road after finding a winding path to take them down the cliff face. It wasn't very wide or well maintained, but it was a definite step up from trekking through seemingly uncharted jungle aimlessly. The trio of boy, girl, and monkey steadily made their way along the road, noticing it begin to widen as well as a few signs of better upkeep. They quickly found out why when it suddenly merged with a much better maintained road that was actually paved. After that, it wasn't long before they reached a small town. Shizuku was grateful for the opportunity to change her clothes and get them cleaned while Naruto stocked up on their supplies. Currently they were sitting in a small outdoor cafe, a plate of steaming dango between them which Shizuku was happily munching her way through. They were getting some odd looks from the town's residents. Naruto guessed it wasn't every day you saw such a young monk and Miko eating casually while occasionally feeding a small capuchin monkey. However, as they ate, Naruto was casting a well-hidden eye around them, not entirely sure what he was looking for himself until he spotted them. A small trio walking along the road, rather unremarkable save for the headbands they all wore. The simple metal plate was engraved with what appeared to be two mirrored lightning bolts that the blonde knew to be the symbol of the hidden Waterfall village. Naruto smiled at that. It was good to see there was a shinobi presence here. It meant they couldn't be too far off from the village itself. Usually hidden villages made good shows of protecting the various towns and settlements within their respective countries. However, most of the time it was merely for appearance's sake. Ninja rarely did anything for free, especially if it spread out their available manpower. If there was an actual patrol in the village and not just some shinobi on their way to, or back from, a mission, then it was a good guess to say Takagakure no Sato was close. Unfortunately, Naruto knew he couldn't just follow them back to their village. As soon as they left the town they would take off at speed, and if the two of them were caught running like that it would be highly suspicious. Naruto had tried asking around town for the way into Taki, but the residents had been very tight-lipped. Apparently even merchants had to go through a special process before being allowed to enter the village. With a sigh, the blonde quickly paid for their food and motioned for his companion to follow him. He couldn't follow the ninja, but nothing was stopping him from traveling in the general direction they were going. Originally, Naruto had planned on using his Rinnegan to seek out the area of high chakra density a hidden village would surely be, but he then remembered shinobi villages had defenses against that kind of thing. It was started by Konoha during the founding of their village. The wife of the Shodai Hokage had constructed an enormous barrier array that would not only hide the village, giving more credit to its name, but also alert a special team of any and all entries into the village. However, it obviously couldn't account for people leaving the barrier if Naruto was able to leave with the ease he did. Other villages had similar countermeasures, mostly against the threat of the Byakugan and Sharingan, which could both see chakra. At first, Naruto had been rather excited when he found the name Mito Uzumaki, going on to discover lots about the Uzumaki clan from the extensive library in the temple. The old Hokage had always told him he was an orphan and didn't know who his parents were. He had always taken that to mean his given name was just chosen at random. However, it had still been fun for the young monk in training to imagine for just a moment he actually had a clan, a rather powerful one at that if the history books were anything to go on. Unfortunately, the Uzumaki, along with their home village Azuchiogakure no Sato, had long been wiped from the elemental nations. On top of that, Naruto had none of the recognizable characteristics of the clan famed for their longevity. He had neither the traditional red hair nor common purple eyes. He didn't count the fact his Rinnegan was purple as much as he would like to. Still, the blonde briefly enjoyed the fleeting fantasy of having a family, even if they were spread to the four winds of the continent. Back in the present, Naruto had moved on to Plan B, which involved a lot of aimless wandering until they happened to come across a clue to Taki's general whereabouts. With that in mind, the duo, or trio if you counted Masaru, left the town in the same direction as the Taki shinobi. Being the country that it was, it didn't take long for Naruto to come across a nice large clearing at the base of an even larger waterfall that provided a nice background roar. Why'd we stop here? I thought we were looking for Taki. Naruto just gave Shizuku a fond grin as he shrugged off his traveling cloak, a thin pole-like protrusion of sand rising from the earth to catch it. While traveling out of Kusa and into Taki, Naruto had worked relentlessly on his manipulation over the element. He was still nowhere near the mastery Gaara had held, but he was definitely closing the gap with his determination and stamina. He pointed over to the raging waterfall behind him as he also began to remove the top portion of his robes, making Shizuku blush for reasons she couldn't quite fathom. That's why we're here at a waterfall. For being only 11, Naruto had a well-trained physique thanks to the rigorous and scheduled training undergone at the temple. His muscles were lean and developed but not overly bulked to the point where they would hinder movement. Monks trained their entire lives so they could run through their training kata flawlessly, able to hold certain awkward positions for hours at a time in deep concentration. You're kidding me. You just expect to search every waterfall in Tani no Kuni and just hope to stumble onto a hidden village. Naruto just gave a large grin and a small nod as he rolled his shoulders, loosening them as he created more sand construct to hold his top and pouches. That too, but I also want to move on to the next level of wind manipulation training. Shizuku widened her eyes in understanding. Occasionally she would see Naruto split leaves with his chakra, and after she had asked he had explained all about the various elements and their individual chakra types. She gulped as she looked up at the enormous waterfall relentlessly pounding down on the small pool next to them. She wasn't sure what she had expected when Naruto had told her about this stage in wind training, but perhaps something smaller. You're going to cut that? Naruto nodded excitedly. Honestly, he had been waiting for an opportunity like this since leaving sooner, and he was raring to go. He had gotten to the point where he could split leaves almost absently, even using different parts of his body. It no longer provided any meaningful challenge to him. The same could be said for the initial stage of fire manipulation, although Naruto could learn that at his leisure, so there was less rush. That's the plan anyway. We'll move from waterfall to waterfall each day, do our usual exercise and look for a way into Taki. With that he smiled and reached into one of the pouches he had placed on the new sand table he had made. After rummaging for a moment he removed a small scroll with a few intricate designs around the edges. On the middle it was printed with a very ornate and archaic kanji for elements. In all, the scroll looked rather old and precious. Shizuku nearly fumbled it when Naruto casually threw it over to her. This is one of the scrolls my senpai gave me before I left the temple. It contains all of the introductory stages to elemental manipulation. You should get as much practice as you can in, so I figured you could start training in your element a bit early. Shizuku just looked at him and the scroll in confusion as the blonde made his way over to the waterfall. But don't we need to figure out my affinity first? Naruto looked back over his shoulder with a serene smile that made Shizuku a little hot despite her thin clothing. Well, technically an affinity only points to the element you would have the most ease in learning. You can technically learn any of them, although the one that opposes your affinity will generally be far too difficult to master. Try out water manipulation first. I'd take an educated guess that is your affinity anyway. The chakra paper would just be to confirm it, or see if you have a bloodline. Shizuku nodded in understanding as she unraveled the scroll, surprised by the level of detail it went into regarding each individual element. By the time she had found the section on water-natured chakra, Naruto had already created a small platform for himself out of compacted sand just in front of the waterfall. In twin puffs of smoke, two identical copies of the blonde appeared and took their places next to him as the original tested out the waters with a hand. The power of the falling water was remarkable. He had heard monks meditated underneath waterfalls on occasion, but after feeling how strong the flow of water was, it seemed a little daunting. Even so, he plunged his hands into the cold waters and began to channel as much wind chakra as he could. While Naruto began the next step of his own training, Shizuku could only watch on in amazement as the tiniest cut in the flow of the impressive waterfall appeared on either side of his outstretched hands. She moved further away, towards the more calm waters further down the large stream. Her scroll recommended a still pond to begin with, but the girl reasoned she had to work with what she had. Rereading the scroll just to be sure, the Violette nodded her head determinedly as she placed her hand flat across the water. The point of the exercise was to pull your hand away from the water, bringing a small pillar of the liquid with it. The higher you could raise your hand without breaking the pillar, the better your control over the element was. Shizuku took a calming breath as she remembered all of the instruction she had received from Naruto about chakra. She quickly found that small flame at her core, manipulating it, guiding the chakra into her hand where she held it. Gently she began to expel the chakra, imagining it liquid and flowing like the scroll instructed. Ever so slowly she pulled her hand away from the stream, her eyes widening in amazement as a small strand of water connected with her palm and rose with it. However, with her excitement came a drop in her concentration, causing the small strand of water to flop lifelessly back into the stream. She looked over to Naruto to tell him of her initial success, only to see the blonde with an intense look of concentration she didn't see from him often. His eyes were open and steeled as he focused his will into halting the flow of the mighty waterfall. Spurred on by this, the purple-haired girl quickly returned to her own task, her determination and resolve renewed as she once again lay her hand flat against the clear water. Over the next week the two youths improved steadily with their respective techniques, Shizuku slightly faster at her own due to it being less complex. Naruto was also having difficulty with how the waterfalls they stopped at each day varied in width. He could already cut the entire waterfall's flow, but not by himself. He had cut it down to only a single shadow clone, but he wanted to master the exercise on his own, so he continued on. Shizuku was surprisingly having more ease with her own training. In the first day she had worked on spreading out her chakra flow to her entire hand in order to get a thicker pillar. After that it was fairly simple to just keep extending the small water pillar while maintaining her focus. She knew the ultimate goal of the exercise was to get it up to at least her waist while maintaining it with as much ease as possible. This was tested by the fact she would have to stand up halfway through raising it. One day she had even tried attempting to speed up the rate at which she could draw the chakra-laced water up with some moderate success. Right now she could just about raise her little pillar of water to her mid-thigh, meaning she was almost there. Naruto had congratulated her on her incredible progress the few times he had come over to supervise. Even with his almost inexhaustible reserves, training so much in wind chakra was tiring for the blonde. Right now the two were relaxing in front of the 10th waterfall on their little tour through the country, leaning up against the enormous cliff it fell from. They had only just arrived, but the sun was beginning to set, so they had decided to forego training for the day to recuperate. They were currently just chatting absently, about little things like Naruto's time in the temple and Shizuku's time in her village. It actually surprised Naruto how much mischief the girl had managed to get up to in her time. It turned out she hadn't really appreciated being shunned and scorned for something she couldn't control. An experience Naruto could relate with. She had taken out her frustrations with various pranks on the villagers, something that hadn't really improved her situation but brought her a much-needed sense of satisfaction. Of course she got caught more than Naruto did when he did pranks, and while funny, they were nowhere near as elaborate. Even so, Naruto found himself laughing with her as she regaled one of the many humorous incidents, trading them for Naruto's own experiences. And so by the time she realized it wasn't her cat eye had already managed to paint the front of the house bright orange. The two of them burst out laughing as they reclined against the craggy stone cliff, Shizuku leaning slightly on Naruto as she sighed out in contentment. "This is really nice, Naruto. I wish you could have come to my village sooner to get me away from there." She sighed again softly as she rested her head on the blonde's shoulder. Naruto wasn't sure what to make of the gesture but returned her smile. "I guess you're like the knight that saves the princess from the tower, except you're a monk and I'm hardly a princess." Naruto chuckled at that, earning a little of Shizuku's ire as she looked up at him with a frown. "What?" Naruto just absently waved, turning his gaze up to the sky, tracing a few of the stars in his head. "I never understood the whole princess or prince deal. I don't get why just because you're born to a daimyo you are royalty. What makes you better than other people? It's like in my old village, the clans there like the Hyuga and the Uchiha were practically considered royalty, but what exactly made them special? I mean, just because they have weird eyes doesn't make them better than others." Shizuku sighed softly as she returned her head to her little perch on the blonde's shoulder. "I guess you can talk, huh? It's just the way things are, I guess. Royalty is royalty and everybody else is just everybody else." Naruto smirked as he stared up at the moon, its crescent shape hanging over the two of them just like everybody else on the continent, an excellent equalizer. "Nah, I've never really cared for all that fate and rights by birth stuff. I mean, you can make it rain anywhere you go. What princess can say that?" Shizuku giggled as her face flushed a pale shade of red for a moment. She quite liked the idea of Naruto comparing her to a princess for some reason. The blonde suddenly got to his feet, turning around and adopting a regal posture, his face turning up slightly into a mock sneer as he offered a hand down to the girl. If you would my heim. Shizuku just giggled again before coughing into her hand and looking away with faked apathy. But it wouldn't be proper monk-san, don't you agree? Naruto's facade broke quickly as a grin spread across his face, quickly mirrored by his companion. However, the mood was quickly ruined by Masaru jumping atop Naruto's head, clinging onto a few blonde strands as he chitted excitedly. Shizuku stood up on her own, giggling at Naruto and the capuchin with her mouth covered by her sleeve. I think Masaru wants to join in. As if agreeing with her, the little monkey stood up, still perched on Naruto's head, and copied his regal posture for a moment, making Shizuku burst out with laughter. However, Naruto suddenly quietened as his gaze drifted to a copse of trees a good distance away. As if that was the trigger, a group of shinobi suddenly appeared from the area, landing on the ground in the recognizable blur of movement that was a shunshin. With some surprise, Naruto noted that the entire squad, 6 of them, were all women, all with their head veiled by hoods and cloths that covered the lower halves of their faces. Identify yourselves. You are dangerously close to Takagakure without authorization. Naruto frowned when they didn't quite specify exactly how far they were from the village. Deciding to just lay along and see if the shinobi would be willing to guide them, Naruto held his hand up slightly in a show of surrender. I'm just a traveling monk on his journey with my companion here. He smiled sheepishly as he rubbed the back of his head, noticing a few of the shinobi's hands twitch toward their kunai pouches as he did so. I was actually looking for Taki with my friend, would you be willing to take us there? The lead kunoiki blinked in surprise at the audacity of the monk as she turned to her squad mates. They spoke in hushed voices for a while that even with his chakra-enhanced hearing Naruto couldn't quite make out. Finally they turned back, the same woman speaking again. She had shiny black hair and light green eyes from what Naruto could see. If you want access into Takagakure no Sato, you are required to be blindfolded and have a disorienting genjutsu placed over you. Do you know what that is? Naruto nodded in confirmation, as did Shizuku behind him. Naruto had gone through most of the major shinobi disciplines with her as they were the main uses for chakra in the world. Shizuku had been interested in the idea of genjutsu, but she didn't think it was nearly as cool as normal ninjutsu sounded. Very well, we were on our way back from patrol anyway. The woman made a hand motion and 2 of the squad came forward, producing strips of cloth which they quickly bound around the 2 teenagers' eyes. Another began to run through hand seals for the genjutsu which would rob the 2 of their sense of direction and muffle their hearing. Unfortunately for them, Naruto's preta-path immediately absorbed the foreign chakra in his system on reflex, rendering the jutsu useless, not that the Taki nin knew that. And he sure wasn't going to tell them and make himself even more of a threat in their eyes. After being somewhat frog-marched through the jungle with Shizuku stumbling every few steps due to the genjutsu, Naruto felt the ground change to a more rocky surface. Naruto could tell they were standing close to another waterfall, not the one they had been by before, and were halted for a moment. Naruto desperately wanted to peep through the blindfold as he heard the sounds of the water diminish slightly, wanting to know exactly what was going on. All he could see right now were the vague outline of the kunoiki by their chakra, all varying shades of light blue. He had spent a lot of time pondering the varying shades of people's chakra. Initially he had believed it was just due to everybody's chakra just being different. However, with the number of people in the elemental nations and only limited shades of blue, that seemed unlikely. From what he knew, everybody in the world was supposed to have a different chakra signature, with twins having the most similar almost to the point of being the same. That alone also meant it wasn't dependent on DNA but something else. From Naruto's perspective, if the color of chakra wasn't part of the signature itself, it must represent something different. He looked around for a moment, his eyes quickly landing on the lead kunoiki who had spoken. Her chakra was the darkest of the group, with the shinobi leading him and Shizuku through the tunnels they had just entered being the next darkest. Perhaps it had something to do with age. Or maybe it was their chakra capacity. Naruto sighed slightly in frustration, the Taki kunoiki mistaking it for frustration at his supposed lack of direction. In fact, Naruto was memorizing each turn they took through the apparent maze of tunnels they were traversing. For all Naruto knew, the color of a person's chakra could mean any number of things. It could be to do with their affinity, their outlook on life, the diet, anything. Then of course there were people like Shizuku and Madara who completely threw any conceptions he might have out the window. His own companion had a different chakra than any other he had seen yet, and Madara's wasn't even blue. Naruto was slightly frustrated he couldn't see his own chakra, even when he looked at his body. He guessed it was to stop him just seeing the chakra in his own eyes, which would render him practically blind. He shrugged his shoulders after a while of thinking. It was something to ponder in meditation, not while traversing unknown tunnels while being escorted by a group of trained shinobi. He just settled for counting and memorizing the various twists and turns he wasn't supposed to be able to feel. He had no intentions of doing anything wrong in Taki, but he had promised to protect Shizuku no matter what, so he could never be too prepared for anything, even escaping a ninja village, again. Time to get up, Fu. A single pair of dull orange eyes snapped open as the sound of a fist banging against a metal door rang through the small room. Fu snorted at the word even as she thought it wasn't a room, it was a prison cell. From the drab white walls to the metal door complete with sliding observation port, the room screamed captivity. The girl had already been awake an hour before the call had come, as she always was, as it always had been for the past 12 years of her life. Slowly she lifted herself up off the barren metal floor from where she had just finished her daily reps, managing to time it perfectly with her warden's wake-up call. Technically he was her caretaker, but Fu knew what their relationship was, just as the man did. No matter how he hid behind that fake veneer of politeness, she saw the hatred and disgust in his eyes, just like everybody else in the village. She sighed. Her life had become so monotonous she could almost count it down like clockwork. 7, 6. She slid her mesh undershirt on over her developing torso, ignoring the slight sheen of sweat she had worked up. 5, 4. Next came her white vest, cut off so that her mesh shirt poked out beneath it, which in turn ended just above her belly button. 3, 2. Finally she slipped her equally white arm warmers, one of which held her forehead protector, up onto her forearms. 1. At that exact moment the metal door creaked open to reveal a tall broad man with large muscles and a shaved head standing in the opening. Fu had known the man nearly all her life, all of it that she could remember anyway. Things were slightly hazy before the Nanabi no Kabutomushi had been sealed inside of her. Absently she glanced down at a spot just above her left breast, right over her heart. If she channeled chakra there a seal would show up, probably the most intricate one in the entire village. Come on. The man's voice was gruff, it always was, and even from where she was standing she could smell the traces of alcohol on his breath. He had no doubt been drinking the previous night. Sometimes Fu loathed the inherent abilities her tenant gave her, not that she didn't have enough things to hate about the powerful creature inside of her. An incredibly heightened sense of smell and taste were just one, and even though she had practically grown up with them, having her whole life to adjust, she still couldn't quite feel right being able to know so much about somebody from the way they smelt. For instance, her caretaker, Kanshu, had a woman in his bed last night. He still reeked of the perfume and lipstick she had worn, despite him having a shower, if the scent of cheap body wash was anything to go by. Fu could even tell what he had eaten this morning, a simple meal of some white rice, miso soup, and grilled fish. Wearily brushing her mint green hair away from her eyes, she quietly followed the man out of the room. It had not taken her long to learn that speaking without being directly asked a question ended badly more often than not. At a reasonable pace the two made their way through the earthen corridors of the compound Fu had lived in for as long as she could remember. It wasn't very large, only a few rooms with essentials for living. In fact, Fu knew exactly how many steps it took to get from her bed to anywhere in the complex. She had to shield her eyes slightly as they walked outside, the sunlight making her wince after her time in the underground dwelling. 32 steps, he walked slightly quicker today. Like the timid little girl she was supposed to be, Fu silently followed her guardian as they made their way through the village, only passing through back alleys and the less populated areas, of course. They wouldn't want to offend the villagers by having the demon girl make an appearance anywhere in the public eye. Fu couldn't help it as her eyes narrowed and her fists clenched, immediately stopping as she noticed Kanshu look back over his shoulder at her. Finally they stopped at a location the girl was also intimately acquainted with, her personal training ground. She snorted in her mind again. The only reason it was hers was because after using it once nobody else would dare come near it again. Everybody had this idiotic notion that they might fall under her demonic influence, or some nonsensical rubbish like that. Then again, she couldn't be all that sure of their motives. It wasn't like she had talked to anybody besides her caretaker, a handful of shinobi that she was forced to work with on missions, and the village leader Shibuki. A rare sliver of hope had once entered Fuu's heart when the previous leader of Taki had passed away from consuming the hero's water. She had hoped with all her heart that Shibuki would be different because he was around her age. He might feel some sympathy or just feel something for her other than disdain. She was right, the boy didn't hate her like the majority of the village. Unfortunately, he was weak-willed, easily manipulated by his advisors, and ultimately, nothing changed. She walked out into the middle of the field, noticing the scratch marks in the ground that might have been ignored had she not known it was a vast sealing array. It was a part of a gift from Konoha to cement the alliance between the two nations, designed to restrain and neutralize Bayu chakra with a single hand sign. Its genius lay in the fact it was powered by the very energy it was restraining, so once it had returned to tolerable levels the seal would naturally disengage, far too brilliant to have ever been thought up by the idiots in her village. That earned yet another mental scoff. Her village, it was like an inmate saying, his prison. This village was no more her home than the soil it lay on was. She only wore the headband because any possible signs of disloyalty would be severely stamped out, by repeated and painful punishment. She absently scratched at the collar around her neck, to all the world appearing as just a simple leather choker with an intricate tribal-like design running its circumference. Fu knew better. With a single hand sign it would instantly send enough electricity through her body that, even while under the influence of her inner demon, would incapacitate her. Depending on the amount of chakra that Kanshu, Shibuki, the advisors, or occasionally shinobi she was on missions with chose to use, it would either knock her out, give her a painful and humiliating shock, or even kill her. Not even her regenerative powers would save her from the huge amounts of energy that would be emitted by the collar. It was her insurance, a cage without bars or even a key. As far as Fu knew, the collar would only ever come off when she died. Maybe not even then, so they could torment her corpse too. Once her training was complete, she was once again led through the now darkening village, cast into shadow by the sun descending behind the great tree in the center of the village. For many it was a symbol of Takagaku's strength and resolve. To Fu, as she descended into a passage right at its base, it was just another reminder of her imprisonment. The door to her cell closed behind her with a metallic clunk, a tray of food sliding in just before it closed, leaving her in silence again. She sat on the bed, staring at the floor. She already knew there were 36 floor tiles. She had counted them hundreds of times. There were 14 cracks on the roof, 3 small holes in the earthen walls, 7 roots sticking out in random places, and 26 scratched on her tough metal bed. This room was her home, it was her life, it was her prison. She listened to Kanshu's steps walking away before sighing quietly as she picked up her tray of food. 32 steps. She finished up her meal, just white rice that was slightly stale and a few raw slices of fish, only the best for the demon. She placed the tray back in its usual place before retiring to her bed, quickly stripping off her now sweaty and dirty clothes. She closed her eyes as she fruitlessly tried to find a comfortable position on the bed. When she opened again, it would all begin anew. Okay, so what first? Food or supplies? Naruto got his answer in the form of Shizuku's stomach rumbling rather loudly, even making a few people passing by turn their heads, much to the girl's embarrassment. Naruto just grinned as his eyes began searching for the nearest cafe or restaurant they could get something cheap. They really needed to get some more money soon. Okay, food it is. Shizuku just put her head down in even more embarrassment as her cheeks flushed a deeper shade of red. The two were standing in a busy street in Taki, civilians and shinobi alike wandering around for either leisure or business. They just had to sit through a rather arduous and boring talk with a village representative to make sure they had no ulterior motives for being in the village. After about 3 hours of moving between various departments in the village leader's tower, they were finally released into the village itself. Naruto quickly rummaged around in his pouches until he produced a small handful of ryo, almost all the money they had left. You go grab us something to eat, we'll meet back in the square in a few minutes. I'll go see about getting some chakra paper and maybe some odd jobs for money. Shizuku seemed nervous about splitting up while Naruto just gave her a calming smile as he patted her on the shoulder. Don't worry, we're perfectly safe here, just try not to annoy anyone, okay? Before Shizuku could round on him in irritation for the comment, he ran off laughing, waving his hand in a somewhat placating manner. Shizuku just sighed as she also began to look around the street for some food. Her eye naturally drifted to a nearby dango stand as a healthy gleam appeared in her eye. Back with Naruto, he was currently moving through a rather thick crowd, which was surprising considering it was still fairly early in the morning. The sun was nowhere near its zenith in the sky and the various shadows were long and stretched. Luckily, with the jingle of his shakuju, most people respectfully moved out of the way for him. He sighed with a smile, just another benefit of being a monk. He had to admit the village was rather beautiful with the enormous tree standing sentinel at the center. A small river wound its way through the middle of the village, skirting around the tree before falling from an enormous cliff as possibly the largest waterfall Naruto had ever seen. Strangely, he couldn't quite discern where exactly they were in the country despite the fact the location should have been fairly obvious. He shrugged it off as some kind of village defense, although it definitely intrigued him as it couldn't be a genjutsu. He ducked into a side alley, deciding he wasn't going to be able to find anything in such a crowded street, opting instead for the quieter, less populated areas. Of course, not being a native to the village, he quickly became lost with only the ever-present tree as a reference point. Sighing in mild frustration, he just decided to ask the next person he saw for direction. Unfortunately, the street he was in seemed to be rather close to the edge of the village and was completely empty. Luckily, as he turned a corner, he nearly walked right into a large man with a muscled physique and shaved head. "Hello, do you mind point me in the direction in which I could purchase some supplies? I was hoping to get some chakra paper for my companion." The man looked down at him, craning his neck due to the considerable size difference as he cocked an eyebrow. People usually weren't on these streets during this time of the day, so he was slightly surprised at the monk's presence. Gruffly, he pointed in the general direction of the tree, somewhere around its base. All shinobi-related supplies are sold in the main trading area on the west side of the tree's base. Naruto inclined his head politely in thanks as the large man turned to go. As the blonde monk made to leave, he noticed the young girl trailing after him, obviously not his child as the two shared no physical resemblance. She was around his age with a shock of mint green hair falling limply about her face, in rather stark contrast to her caramel skin and pure white clothing. Just as they passed one another, the girl raised her head slightly from where it was submissively bowed and Naruto was able to catch a glimpse of her startling orange eyes. Just like that though, the moment passed and the two moved past him, in the direction of the village's outskirts by the look of it. Naruto just blinked as his forehead furrowed slightly. There was something awfully familiar about the girl that he couldn't place. He couldn't see her chakra, there appeared to be something suppressing it, preventing him from seeing anything. However, when he turned back around to look again, the two had already disappeared around the corner. With a sigh, the blonde just ran a hand through his hair and started off in the direction he had been pointed in. Orange, what a great color for someone's eyes. He could only think that with a smile as he walked off, his mind strangely fixed on that curious girl. When he and Shizuku finally met up again, the girl was rather happily demolishing a small take-away box of dango. The blonde just sighed as he walked up, his seals and pouches freshly filled with supplies. He had also found a few people looking for help around their shops that would net them enough money to move on to a new place after about a week or so, at least as long as Shizuku didn't drain them dry with her strange dango obsession. Really, Shizuku? The girl just grinned cheekily, uncaring that she had red bean paste on the corners of her mouth. Of course, dango's the best. Come on, you must have a favorite food, right? She said it with a rather flippant smirk, but upon seeing Naruto suddenly tense and withdraw on himself slightly, the girl became shocked. She had never seen Naruto like this. He was always either serene or just happy around her. In fact, she had never seen a negative emotion from the blonde except the occasional frustration. Seeing his suddenly clam up like this was slightly strange, but almost as soon as it happened the monk recovered, although a little of the shine in his eyes was missing. Yeah, sure. He waved her off as he sat down, grabbing a stick for himself out of the box. I guess dango's fine if you promise not to overdo it, okay? He looked up at her with a faux concerned tone which Shizuku just smiled at with a small imperceptible sigh of relief. No promises. Naruto chuckled as he finished off his stick, quickly reaching into one of his pouches and withdrawing a few slips of plain, square paper no larger than his palm. I got the chakra paper. Once we find a training ground to use, we'll get you tested, okay? Shizuku frowned with a pout as she reached for a slip of the paper, only for Naruto to pull his hand away. Ah, why can't we just do it now? I'm really curious. Naruto chuckled again as he replaced the paper in his pouch, sealing it tightly so they wouldn't fall out. Yeah, I am too, to be honest, but it's suspicious for non-shinobi to be seen using chakra, especially for things like elemental manipulation, and even more especially in the middle of a shinobi village where aren't even residents. We don't know if they have senses or other means of detecting use of chakra, so we should be careful unless we're in a training field, okay? Shizuku maintained her rather cute pout but nodded after seeing Naruto wasn't going to relent on this anytime soon. Fine. She looked up suddenly with a curious expression, finishing off the last of her dango with one clean swipe along the skewer. Did you find us a place to stay? Naruto gave an absent nod as he swallowed another dumpling, allowing his eyes to drift around the small square they were sitting in. There were a few people milling about, enjoying their breakfasts outdoors, and even a few couples just lounging around. Yeah, there were a few temples I passed, and one of the masters used to be a monk at the fire temple. He'll let us stay in one of the dojos for a few days until we move on. Shizuku nodded with a happy smile. She had wondered what it might be like to stay in a temple, even if it was only for a few nights. Suddenly a thought snuck up on her as she looked down at the clothes she was wearing. Will I have to get robes like you? Naruto finally looked around at her, amusement twinkling in his steely eyes before turning back with a small chuckle. No, I think you'll be fine. Shizuku didn't like the rather mischievous grin the blonde now sported. Fu sat at the center of her training ground alone. Kanshu never stayed for very long when she trained. She assumed it was because, like everybody else in the village, he despised being around her when she tapped into her Bijuu's chakra. A part of her couldn't blame him. She had been using it for almost 7 years now and still wasn't used to the sheer oppressive feel of the dense red chakra. However, a much louder part of her was disgusted at the man for his cowardice. She sighed wearily as she continued to channel her chakra, running through hand seals at a rapid pace. It wasn't like she could leave the training ground anyway. If she stepped out of the seal before Kanshu deactivated it, she would immediately be shocked. He had once gotten drunk and forgotten about her, leaving her alone overnight with nothing but her fairly thin clothes. It hadn't helped that it was nearly the middle of the winter. She was sure if it wasn't for the Nanabi's chakra she would have died that night from either the cold or the sickness that might follow if she wasn't immune to any and all illnesses. And of course, when Kanshu did return to deactivate it, he failed to offer even so much as a grunt of an apology, looking instead like she had to apologize to him for surviving the ordeal he put her through. Right now she was safely channeling 3 tails of her Bijuu's chakra, which manifested as a pair of insectoid wings and a long spindly tail that grew from her lower back out of pure chakra. She had once tried to fly with them, but that ended with her waking up a day later in chakra-suppressing manacles in her cell. It seemed the seal on her training ground was fairly sensitive to anything it might consider as her leaving. Right now this was her safe limit. At 4 tails she began to become more aggressive and less capable of rational decision, and at 5 tails she lost it altogether. It turned out she was a rather unique case among Jinchuriki due to the nature of her tenant. With each alternating tail she increased 2, she would either gain another set of wings or the tail and never both, otherwise she might have an odd number of wings which wouldn't work. It was almost poetic in a way, the fact that she had wings and longed more than anything to be free from this hell yet no way to use them at all. She had often wondered if the collar had a limited range, and that was why the village was so adamant about her not being able to fly, but in the end that was a useless train of thought. Rinpungakur no Jutsu. She finished her hand seals as she exhaled a large cloud of bright glittering dust that caught the light in ways some would have found beautiful. She switched her hands to the tiger seal and almost immediately the entire cloud combusted, scorching the already dead ground beneath it. The girl sighed as she looked at the result of her jutsu. With just 3 tails, almost half the entire training ground was enveloped in the jutsu's area of effect, and she hadn't even put all the chakra she could into it. She allowed her chakra cloak to drop, putting a hand to her forehead to stave off the headache that always came with it. "Old, you don't worry about it, it's nothing." The mint-haired girl blinked as new voices suddenly approached the training ground, her ears twitching to pick up the conversation. It wasn't Kanshu, that was for certain, and nobody else ever came near this training ground. She thought it might be some uninformed genin, but she got her answer when she turned. "If it's nothing, then why won't you?" "Oh. It was a boy and girl around her age, maybe a little younger. The blonde appeared to be dressed as a monk, complete with shakuju and the general air of peacemen of that lifestyle held. His eyes were narrowed but not in a suspicious way, she still couldn't see his eyes though, which instantly gave him somewhat of a mysterious feel. Suddenly she recognized him as the boy she had passed earlier that morning on the way to the training ground. The girl was shorter, dressed in a Miko outfit despite not holding much of the regal grace and poise women of that profession naturally acquired. She seemed more like a girl playing dress up, which rather amused Fu, something that hadn't happened in a while. Usually it was either contempt or just plain irritation, rarely genuine amusement. She had flowing purple hair that actually made the vedette a little jealous. Her hair was always cut short so it would never impede her vision. Obviously a weapon did not need to look good, only be efficient. The boy finally seemed to notice the training ground he had entered was not empty and gave a small wave to Fu, surprising her. Oh hello, I didn't realize this training ground was occupied. Fu was a little shocked when she found herself sighing internally. She hadn't even realized she could still care enough to do that. Even so, she knew what came next. Realization she was the demon, a few snide or thinly veiled insults and then they would leave her. I hope you don't mind, this is one of the only training grounds with a waterfall. And with that the blonde just walked further in, the girl following him quickly like a puppy. Fu actually blinked in visible surprise, she had not expected that. She gulped a little as she realized somebody had actually spoken with her. No threats, no insults, no hidden loathing or even open hatred. He had just spoken with her. And no, it's fine. Her voice was rather meek, she hadn't used it in a while and her throat was a little dry from the jutsu she had been practicing. She watched with a little anxiety as the boy walked over to the waterfall at the back of the training ground, up against a large cliff face that bordered on side of the village. This was one of the furthest training grounds from the village proper. It was Fu so that nobody would panic when she used her Bijuu's chakra, or have to accidentally run into her. The boy made a small show of producing a few slips of chakra paper. Fu recognized it from when she went through a similar test. Her own affinities were water and wind, with the latter being the primary nature of her chakra. She watched with just a hint of interest as the violet took the paper, seemingly taking a moment to concentrate as she pushed her chakra through it. It could be easily said that everybody was rather startled as the paper suddenly burst into water. Fu didn't have a great amount of experience but she knew that was not normal, even so the pair seemed to get over it quickly. As she watched, the duo continued to amaze her as the blonde stripped of his top layers, laying him neatly by the bank of the stream, and strode out until he was just in front of the raging water. As soon as he placed his hands under the falling stream it slowly began to split, around 3/4 of the reasonably sized water feature getting cut. Fu recognized it, having gone through the same process for her own elemental manipulation, but that was only because she was a weapon, honed from a young age. To see somebody so young that was obviously not a shinobi go through advanced elemental manipulation training with such shocking ease was just unreal. The concept of true exhaustion was fairly foreign to the green-haired Jinchuriki due to her unnaturally large chakra reserves, but she knew such exercises were by no means supposed to be easy. She immediately noted with a trained eye what was holding him back from completing the exercise and just couldn't help herself. He's only focusing on the chakra he is expelling, forgetting to focus on the chakra already outside of his body and keep that sharp. Despite her only mumbling it absently as if commenting on a piece of machinery and the fact that the boy was standing in a rather loud waterfall, he seemed to hear her. He turned, his narrowed eyes regarding her for a moment before a small smirk appeared over his face. As if he lived only for surprising her, the next time he plunged his hands into the waterfall split perfectly, all the way along. Fu's jaw was about to unhinge itself from her shock. Not only had he heard her, he had corrected himself so easily after only hearing a rather vague piece of unintentional instruction. Seemingly satisfied with his completion of the exercise, the boy waded back out of the water and began to walk over to her. She tensed slightly as he approached, knowing that if they started a fight she would have no choice. It wasn't like she could run. Either was she would be punished for fighting within the village or trying to escape her training ground. Thanks, I was stuck for a while with that. The caramel-skinned girl wasn't quite sure how to answer, just standing there with a rigid posture at the unfamiliar sensation of talking with somebody. As if sensing her unease, the blonde smiled at her in a disarming manner before gently raising his arm out. I'm Naruto, by the way. Fu just blinked as she stared down at his outstretched hand, regarding it cautiously as she subconsciously shifted her weight onto her back foot. The tiniest flicker of a frown ran across Naruto's brow before he covered it with that same serene smile. It's a handshake, you know, a sign of friendship. He said it jokingly with a small chuckle at the end, but somehow Fu knew he was gauging her reaction. When she continued not to answer, Naruto put his hand down before motioning over to where Fu could see the other girl practicing the first stage of water manipulation. That's Shizuku, and the monkey is Masaru. It was only at that moment Fu noticed a small capuchin, somewhat common in the forests around the village, sitting next to the purple-haired girl, watching her perform the exercise. She couldn't believe it had slipped past her notice. It was so covered in the girl's scent that she hadn't properly sensed its presence. She knew it was because she was so confused by what was going on that it had simply slipped her mind. If her handler could see her now, she would probably be on the ground, writhing from the collar's shock for missing a potentially important piece of information like that. Fu. It came out rather weak again, so she coughed slightly and said it again, slightly more forcefully though. Naruto just smiled at her and extended his hand once more. This time Fu tentatively placed her own out, broadening Naruto's grin as he went to grasp it. In reflex, Fu immediately grabbed his wrist, twisted her body and threw the boy over her shoulder. To her surprise though, he landed on his feet gracefully, in a flash adjusting his posture into that of a taijutsu stance she didn't recognize. Well, I wasn't going to ask for a spar just yet, but alright. Fu just shifted onto her back foot again with some hesitancy. She had attacked the boy and he was still smiling at her. Even if he wasn't verbally abusing her for being a demon, he should still feel some hostility towards her for that. In her confusion, it took her a few moments to register what he had said, neither of them moving in the meantime. What's a spar? Naruto blinked in surprise, giving Fu the briefest flash of steely purple orbs behind his usually concealing eyelids. He dropped out of his stance, cocking his head ever so slightly to the side. You know, a friendly fight between friends. Fu's brow furrowed in confusion again. It felt as though every moment she spent with this boy, new, perplexing ideas were being thrown at her that she couldn't understand. She didn't know a lot about friendship. Considering she had never had a friend before, it was not surprising, but she understood enough to know friends weren't supposed to fight. Why would friends fight? Naruto cocked an eyebrow at her, still not shifting from his more relaxed posture just as Fu didn't move from her own defensive stance. Well, it isn't really a fight, more like a mock battle to test your skills without the threat of your opponent killing you. Fu blinked warily. She had never experienced something like that. All the opponents she had ever faced in combat had been real and 100% ready to deal her serious harm. It was kill or be killed for her to get experience, and so far she was still alive to think about it. So if we spar, we are friends. Again the girl's brow furrowed in intense befuddlement, which led to a slightly concerned look to flit across the blonde's features, not that Fu recognized the emotion. Well, I suppose you could look at it that way. Friends, rivals, comrades, sparring doesn't exactly necessitate friendship, but it can be a sign of it. Fu's intense look slightly relaxed at that, but she still seemed defensive and confused, like a cornered animal wondering why the predator had not gone in for the kill yet. Naruto was actually a little surprised she hadn't run off yet from the way she was acting. So you wish to become my friend? Naruto smiled brightly at that as he shrugged casually, the motion catching the vedette off guard. Sure, if you want to. Immediately Fu's features hardened into a scowl as her posture became far more aggressive, still not eliciting any meaningful response from the blonde. At this point Shizuku was looking over at the two with curiosity and a small hint of concern for her friend. Why? Naruto cocked his head again, the very casual and unconcerned motion again confusing Fu in a manner she didn't understand, so was naturally frustrated by. I didn't know I needed a reason to make friends with somebody. At this point Fu was trembling in barely controlled rage, her tenant's chakra on the verge of breaking through. Stop this, whatever it is you are doing, stop it. Is hating me not enough for you? Now you have to try and break my spirit as well. I won't let you. With that the lithe Taki kunoiki shot forward, her arm outstretched with her palm flattened like a blade. In the minuscule time it took for her to cross the distance between them, Naruto had already shifted into a defensive stance of the Mizu no Mai. As her bladed hand came in, he latched onto her wrist, diverting her arm and allowing her forward momentum to carry her forward until her body was flush against his back. Before she could react, Naruto dropped down into a perfect split, never letting go of the girl's wrist. Fu was already destabilized from the unexpected move, so when Naruto slightly jerked on her hand, she rolled forward with almost no resistance. The whole movement flowed seamlessly together like a flowing stream, and fairly soon Fu found herself on her back against the slightly damp earth. With the grace and agility only intense and earnest training could provide, she rolled back to her feet, noting that Naruto had made no move to capitalize on her being grounded. She shot forward quickly, although this time it was a feint. At the last moment, as she saw Naruto's hand come up to grab her wrist, she instead grabbed his, pulling hard and bringing her knee up at the same time. In an impressive display of flexibility and control, Naruto instead pushed off as he felt his balance shift, launching himself up and over the girl with a burst of chakra-enhanced movement. During the girl's confusion, he switched the grip before landing with both feet solidly planted on the ground, using chakra to stick there and pulling the girl up and over his shoulder in one swift move. Once again, Fu found herself rolled onto her back, confused by the lack of pain she felt from what could have been a severely debilitating attack. However, this time when she got up, it wasn't as fast, and she suddenly felt rather woozy, like they had been fighting for much longer than 2 minutes. Shaking her head to clear the cobwebs as best she could, she watched the blonde with caution while he just maintained that same unconcerned smile. "You have a lot of chakra." Ignoring his words as needless banter, despite feeling confusion as to how he knew that, Fu launched herself forward, using chakra to enhance the movement this time. Once again at the last moment though, Naruto sidestepped, lashing out his hand to suddenly appear behind her, holding both wrists solidly. Fu tried to struggle, but the longer he held her, the weaker she felt and the less she could concentrate. Finally, when she felt her legs weaken to the point she was only just about standing, Naruto released her, making her stumble forward on uncertain feet. "See, now that was a good spar." Fu just breathed heavily as she turned to the blonde. "Why?" She panted for breath before straightening up. "Why are you doing this?" Naruto sighed wearily as he ran a hand through his hair, the serene smile vanishing for a moment as it was replaced by a slightly weaker, but more genuine one. "I don't know what kind of conceptions you have about me, but I don't mean you any kind of harm, Fu." The mint-haired girl looked down, her hair shadowing her dull orange eyes as she stared at the barren ground at their feet. Naruto began to feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise as virulent red chakra began leaking out of Fu's pores, quickly forming a cloak with a single long thread-like tail flowing behind her. Her head was enshrouded in what looked like a visor as 4 small arm-like protrusions emerged from the abdomen area of the cloak. "I don't believe you." The girl rushed forward again, this time at incredibly speeds that Naruto's eyes could just about follow, but his body would only be able to react at the very last moment if he continued to only use taijutsu. He flashed an arm up to prepare a Shinra Tensei, but he never needed to. As Fu approached him, she suddenly froze, her forward momentum carrying her forward into the ground to create a long but shallow trench with her body. The cloak began to recede, and when it was finally gone, Naruto could see the vedette was writhing on the ground, in obvious agonizing pain as her hands scrabbled at the simple black choker around her neck. Naruto had noticed the small amount of chakra in the accessory but had thought nothing of it. After all, his staff, pouches and even earring all had small amounts of chakra in them. Looking around, he quickly found the cause in that same large shaven-headed man from before, holding his hands in the rat hand seal. "What are you doing?" The man looked up at the monk, genuine surprise in his eyes at the question, but more so at the concern in Naruto's voice. Fu might have been surprised or confused as well, but right now her world was the blinding pain coming from the collar. "I am disciplining a kunoichi of the village." Naruto's eyes widened in horror slightly, not enough to reveal his Rinnegan though. "You do this to all your shinobi?" The man stared suspiciously at the monk, beginning to wonder why he was at the training ground at all. Nobody but him and Fu came here. "That is none of your concern, monk-san. Please leave me to deal with the shinobi under my authority." Naruto just looked desperately between the man and the still obviously agonized girl on the ground. "Please stop this, she did nothing wrong." The man again narrowed his eyes at the boy before finally releasing the seal. Fu was left twitching on the ground, her eyes wide and unfocused as she gasped in large breaths of air. "Explain what happened here." Naruto nodded once quickly, casting a furtive look at Fu, who had just about stopped twitching. My friend and I were simply wandering the village and saw her training here. I offered to spar with her, that's all. The man cast a look between the blonde and Fu, who was now beginning to pick herself up. Naruto noted that her posture had become submissive and withdrawn, her eyes looking glassy like they better belonged on a dead person. Well, I recommend in the future you avoid engaging in spars with our shinobi monk-san. Especially this one. He cast a dirty look at the now partially recovered girl who had moved over to his side without a word. Come on Fu, we're going back to your home. Fu didn't even blink or acknowledge the statement in the slightest, she just followed with small measured steps as the burly man went to walk away, leaving Naruto and Shizuku very confused and worried for the mint-haired girl. Shizuku walked over, her eyes following the pair as they left until they were out of sight completely. Why was he doing that to that poor girl? She didn't get a response immediately, so she turned to look at Naruto. Like her, his eyes were following the girl and her large guardian, although he was following their chakra signatures until those two vanished. His hair fell about his forehead, shadowing his eyes as his knuckles clenched in the grip on his shakuju. I don't know. He looked up, his eyes open and burning with the chakra running through them, making them glow in a way Shizuku might find ominous if she didn't know the blonde. But I intend to find out. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.